Thank you, everyone who's here today. You are in for a treat. It is beyond a pleasure. I am very happy to introduce Vanessa Drake Moraga to you. Someone I've known since 1992. Traveled in Chile with Vanessa and her husband many years ago. And we share a love of the textiles, not just of the Kuba peoples, but of many cultures and time. We also share a love of modernism. So Vanessa is the scholar, the leading author of our book, Designing Dynamism, available in the store for your purchase and in the galleries if you just want to do some reading this afternoon after the reception. Vanessa, as I said, is a scholar of Kuba Textiles and the author of she was a guest curator and the author of Weaving Abstraction, Kuba Textiles and the Woven Art of Central Africa, which took place at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C. in 2011. She has contributed to many scholarly journals. She also co-authored most recently the huge tome, African Textiles, with Duncan, Clarke, and Sarah Fay. That's 2022. One of her publications that I love the most is called Animal, Myth, and Magic, Images from Pre-Columbian Textiles from 1995. Her talk this afternoon, Patterns of Influence, Kuba Textile Art as Inspiration in 20th Century Design, explores the history of Western abstraction, adaptation, and appropriation of Kuba surface design and textile artistry, at the turn of the 20th century. Vanessa?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming today. And thank you to Annie, of course, for inviting me here to talk at the Mint, and to the Mint Museum for putting on this beautiful exhibition, so magnificently conceived and designed by Stephen Burke's Man-Made. In a way, actually, that allows us intent focus on the textile compositions themselves, and is also enriched by the voices and the names of the contemporary makers in Kinshasa, as they show in their documentary. And of course, Wesley Mancini, whose gift of his Kuba collection to the Mint was the impetus for this exhibition, and whose own practice and engagement with Kuba patterning, evident in some of his cloth shown at the front of the exhibition, in a sense, it dovetails perfectly with my theme today. To begin. So, Kuba surface design, developed by women artists in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, over centuries of textile creation and innovation, has yielded one of the most brilliant pattern languages in the world. And even if you haven't yet seen the exhibition, you will find that you are already extremely familiar with this visually charismatic tradition, because Kuba ideas permeate all facets of global design today. In fact, we now live surrounded by Kuba patterning. And this slide is a sample of the myriad examples I've culled over the years, demonstrating how Kuba-derived geometric motifs and pattern schemes are evident in so many contexts: advertising, graphic arts, costume design, home furnishings, merchandise ranging from carpets, upholstery to towels and doormats, and even, I didn't put in the image, your Peet's coffee cup and your Starbucks, loyalty card. And of course, fabric and fashion accessories of all types. But in addition to this worldwide commercial application, modern Kuba raffia cloth, produced in traditional techniques and exported from the DRC, is regularly featured in residential interior and retail decoration, even rather anachronistically in the set from the recent film Lenny, Maestro, about Leonard Bernstein. And the origins of what has now become this global design language is the Kasai region in the very heart of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the Kuba Kingdom has been established since the 17th century. This ancient multi-ethnic federation consists of about 19 regional chieftains who all are under the political authority of one king from the Bushong, whose courtiers are portrayed, or the courtiers of a previous king, are portrayed in this portrait, in this photograph from the 1930s, showing a welcoming ceremony at the royal capital in Sheng. The Kuba peoples have long been famous, both within and outside the region, for the elegance of their attire and the exceptional artistry and creative vitality of their textile arts. The most aesthetically complex and stylistically diverse tradition of ceremonial dress and regalia and prestige cloth to have developed in the interior of Central Africa. The textiles are distinctive for being woven from raffia palm fiber and embellished with locally devised techniques of cut pile embroidery, as well as several methods of applique and resist dyeing. And one essential aspect of this tradition is that historically, the Kuba successfully resisted Western contact and the encroaching colonial expansionism until the 1880s. The realm was closed to the outsiders, including neighboring peoples, by edict of the king. In fact, the first Westerner to enter Kuba territory and access the royal court was the African-American missionary William Shepherd, who also assembled the first significant collection of Kuba art, which is in the Hampton University Museum in Virginia. And this isolation from foreign influence and trade cloth meant that the Kuba textile traditions remained intact through the end of the 19th century and beyond. So we have a unique situation for Central Africa in that we can trace the continuity and evolution of textile styles over the 20th century and chart a design fluorescence that occurred during and after 60 years of Belgian colonization through the post-independent period up until today. Africa has been described as the continent of patterning, an image that encompasses the tremendous diversity of landscape, topographies, nature, animals, as well as the art and attires of as many peoples. And Kuba culture is known for a total immersion in and absolute fascination with pattern. In traditional times, pattern signified prestige, intensely decorated wooden objects and beaded adornments. There are a couple of examples in the exhibition, as well as regalia and raffia textiles embellished with two-dimensional designs, drawing on their ancient craft heritage of over 200 name motifs, symbols, and emblems, project elite status and wealth in a society that was conceived to be formal, hierarchical, with a large title-holding class of royals, eagle-feathered chiefs, clan heads, and many types of dignitaries. And in this milieu, pattern innovation and originality are highly valued, spurring the expressive freedom of the style. Women textile and pattern makers, like these two women from a 1930s era photograph, are the major generators of this versatile geometric language and the visual ideas most equated with Kuba design, like those explored in panels on view, some of which I've included here. These include rhythmical interlocking pattern progressions, complicated with improvisations, asymmetry, and metamorphic reconfigurations of shape and line, as well as random shifts of scale, color, accent, or textural effect. And Kuba textile makers have developed multiple strategies to achieve this. As improvisation is, in fact, the defining characteristic and modality of their art form. And as you will discover in many of the panels on view in the galleries, this variability of detail occurs on both the large and small scale. Even a single diamond or cross or chevron set within a regular pattern sequence or structure can offer a small microcosm of change and fractal complexity. And Showa women, from one of the smaller chieftains in the Kuba Federation, are generally regarded as the most graphically daring of Kuba embroidery artists. These women are actually Bushong royals. The Showa lived south of the Sankura River, which was the first river in the interior Kasai that the European explorers and traders began navigating in the 1880s, pursuing exploitable resources and commercial opportunities. And from the outset, Kuba Textiles was seen as exceptional, as much for their artistry and technical accomplishment as for their improbably fine weaves and textures obtained with fiber threads painstakingly processed from raffia palm leaves. These were the textiles that caught the eye of the Western avant-garde, with a galvanizing effect on design and art in the early decades of the 20th century through to the present day. Okay. Kuba Textiles first became known outside of Central Africa in colonial expositions in Antwerp, Brussels, and Paris in the 1890s, but it was formal collecting expeditions in the Kasai during the first decades of the 20th century, as well as the influx of Kuba textiles into Europe, that triggered interest in the tradition among artistic circles that were already stimulated by African aesthetics, primarily figural sculpture and masks. And of course, we know who those artists are from Picasso and the Cubists onwards. But although rarely identified, let alone acknowledged, the eccentric geometries explored in Kuba surface design, particularly the striking and experimental abstraction of the Showa velvety prestige panels, supplied modernist artists and their contemporaries working across the applied arts with a liberating source of inspiration. In a trend that persists today, the periodic international waves of interest in Kuba design have typically coincided with museum and gallery exhibitions produced outside the DRC. And actually, this is where Stephen and Malika's project is so valuable, because it returns us back to the Congo, back to the Kuba makers themselves. But going back in time, among the first serious presentations of Kuba objects was displayed at the British Museum in London in 1911. And that represented the enormous body of material that had been acquired in the Congo between 1907 and 1909 by a Hungarian ethnographer, Emile Torday. And the Kuba aesthetic was a revelation to the English public and critics. And one of the people most impressed was an influential art historian, critic, and curator, Roger Fry. And unusually for the time, Fry singled out the intense flexibility and accidental play of variation characterizing Kuba textiles. He compared these traits to carpet designs by Duncan Grant, who was one of his co-founders, along with the artist Vanessa Bell, of the Omega workshops in 1911. The Omega Workshop, which I'm sure many of you know, was affiliated with the Bloomsbury Literary and Intellectual Group, and it aimed to inject a spirit of experimental modernism into the production of home textiles, rugs, clothing, painted furniture, pottery, and decorative objects of all kinds. And their painterly pictorial and abstract decorative style really reflected the color sensibility and bold shapes of the Fauves and the Cubists that Fry had introduced to the London art world. But as the images in this slide indicate, one genre in particular drew conspicuously on Kuba templates, most likely at Fry's instigation. These design drawings by Frederick Etchells, Grant, and Bell avail themselves of the signature stylistic features of Kuba textiles. Narrow borders framing a square or rectangle composed with spontaneously brushed interlocking geometries based on lozenge, triangle, and irregular L shapes, as well as slanted and parallel lines of uneven length and widths that evoke the dimensional quality of Kuba cloth, which is created by the low relief contrast between flat linear stitching and plush color blocks. For example, the carpet design attributed to Grant and or Bell at the top left reproduces the square layout and compositional structure of a Kuba panel collected by Torday, which is seen below. In Grant's interpretation, the center field is filled with sort of a free-form rendering of an iconic Kuba motif named Woto after their mythical ancestor. And amazingly, I just came across this painting a couple of weeks ago by Vanessa Bell that depicts the actual rug produced from the design in her home at Charleston, where incidentally the wallpaper in the dining room still features Kuba-like designs. Most of these borrowings were adapted for fabrics and hand-tufted rugs, but in the image at the top right, Winifred Jill, one of the Omega artists, is draped in a shawl or cloth which is decorated with a repeat pattern lifted straight from the Kuba and Congo style of embroidery. The vibrant colors of the Omega designers that they applied to the repertoire diverges, of course, from the typical color schemes seen in Kuba Textiles, which reflect locally available plant materials and dyes, as well as the inherent limitations of dyeing raffia. Until the introduction of new sources of botanical and chemical colors around the mid-20th century, Kuba Textiles mainly favored two-tone combinations of the natural yellow, tan, and gold hues of undyed raffia, offset by bluish-black threads obtained with iron-rich mud dyes. Textiles, especially those intended as funerary tribute and funerary dress, were also overdyed with a color called tukula, a colorant obtained from a tropical hardwood, and it was a color that had profound spiritual connotations. So given the range of artistic materials at the Europeans' disposal, this shift to a new colorism was probably inevitable. And it found spectacular expression in another sphere of Western engagement with and reworking of Kuba design themes in the textile creations of the remarkably entrepreneurial French-Ukrainian artist Sonia Delaunay, pictured here in her studio around 1924, and Delaunay became one of the leading fashion and textile designers of 1920s Paris and the Art Deco era. So Delaunay had already developed a varied and idiosyncratic artistic practice that not only encompassed painting, but also the making of clothing and textiles in a range of styles, from the patchwork assemblages of her first simultaneous dress and quilt to the rainbow-hued, curvilinear spherical motifs of theatrical costumes she designed for the Ballet Russe. And her lyrical painting aesthetic also emphasized concentric discs and arcs, radiating in luminous and vivid color spectrums and prismatic refractions, which aligned with her and her husband Robert Delaunay's theories of simultaneous contrast, the pairing and interaction of complementary colors to heighten their optical effect. However, around 1923, Delaunay pattern schemes underwent a radical shift, a transition which I think is sort of caught by that small design at the top right, which shows these intersecting geometries. The intersecting circles and rounded shapes give way to dynamic geometric arrangements built with irregular lozenge and triangle motifs defined by sharp cubist angles, overlapping diagonals, jagged zigzags, and sawtooth bands. And these designs became the basis of her extensive collection of fabric, block-printed and embroidered clothing and fabric that she produced under the label of the Boutique Simultanée. And there's been a flurry of exhibitions and catalogues recently focusing on the entire scope of Delaunay's incredible career and voluminous output in all media. And I'm not a Delaunay scholar nor an expert, but none of these recent surveys, which were at the Bard, the Guggenheim, the Tate, and everywhere else, has tackled what to me is her obvious debt to Kuba embroidered artists that goes beyond coincidental affinities of form. Other than alluding to the vogue for l'art nègre, black art, dance, performance, and jazz in Paris at this time, or noting sort of unspecified African influences and resonance animating her and the creations of other Parisian couturiers. And the blatant mixing and mining of motifs from exotic places and cultures, mostly in the colonies, was widespread during this era. But the designers never admitted to those sources, and it's a common practice even today. And perhaps the omission among contemporary artists contemporary scholars is not surprising, because not only is there a wide lack of knowledge about the history and richness of Kuba textile traditions across the contemporary art field, there is apparently no record of Delaunay herself ever mentioning it or any other African visual tradition as an inspiration. So I've had to do some sort of reverse engineering here based on my familiarity with the Cuban pattern aesthetic and the early history of collecting these textiles. So this slide is a small representation of the dozens of textile designs she generated that play with the rhombus, a half or quarter diamond, or a triangle. And you may well ask, well, what is especially Kuba-like about these elemental geometric shapes? Or what differentiates such designs from any standard harlequin pattern or multicolored diamond lattice, as in the kinds of dance and theatrical costumes she created previously? And that stunning Kuba panel on the right from the Mancini Collection gives us some insight into some of the more patent commonalities. As in Delaunay's sketches, a lozenge or an interlocking configuration of lozenge is the basis of much Kuba surface design. And Kuba makers manipulate this model, as they do with most motifs in their repertoire, with an extraordinary malleability which is afforded by the flexibility of the needlework and punctiform pile techniques. They scale it at different sizes across the plane, not necessarily in regular order or rhythm, rearranging and recombining the expanding and shrinking motifs to dazzling optical intensity. Their blocks are multiplied, subdivided, nested, delineated with concentric lines. All possible variants and symmetries are explored. And Delaunay, like the Omega designers, similarly juxtaposes different weights of line, thin and wide, evoking the surface interaction between the parallel lines of fine stitching, outlining the shaped dimensional cut pile motifs in the Kuba artworks. Again, like a Kuba artist, she plays with the solidity of negative and positive space, or accents sections of a line or one edge of a block with random switches of color. And you can compare these effects in the red, white, and gray printed fabric down at the left with the strategies employed in the Kuba panel. And I also find that that yellow and green swatch in the top row is extremely reminiscent of Kuba composition. Even the dots in the center, to me, suggest the touch of a Raphael pile technique. And naturally, as these photographs of two models in sort of complementary styles of beach outfits shows, she continued to manipulate a variety of different geometric forms in her simultaneous fashions, although she forcefully asserted that these basic forms were merely vehicles for her interpretation and investigation of color. Yet despite her protestations, there's a pronounced Kuba stamp and energy to her geometries and fabrics during this fertile period between 1922 and 1926. So, in the absence of any statement or attribution in her published papers or interviews, what evidence is there for the designer's exposure to Kuba textiles? Delaunay was deeply embedded in the Parisian avant-garde of artists, poets, writers, intellectuals, photographers, theater directors who were transforming and shaping modern art world. And one of the central figures was Tristan Tzara, the Dadaist poet and performer, and Tzara was a great friend of Sonia's. They collaborated professionally on several Dadaist dramatic productions around 1922. And Tzara, moreover, was a noted collector of African art and textiles, one of the first in Paris, and undoubtedly Delaunay would have been well aware of his acquisitions. And he took interesting advantage of his collection, in fact. He lined the walls of the study in the house that on Montmartre that he commissioned from the Austrian architect Adolf Loos in 1927 with double-paneled overskirts, where they are served not only as a textural and graphic decorative material for interior design, but as a combinational artistic assemblage. And several other of Tzara's prestige cloths were subsequently published in Tissu Negre in 1931, the first portfolio to highlight the artistry of African textiles, not only Kuba, and to make the oft-repeated comparison between Kuba fabrics and with what the editor described as the syncopated rhythms of a jazz tune. And that was actually the first publication, the only publication until about the 1980s, focusing on Kuba Textiles. And in fact, the only Delaunay design from this period that is actually given a name is one titled African Fabric, that the publisher, Jacques Damas, who was her most avid promoter in her later career and her publisher, noticed was inspired by La Negre. And it's seen in two colorways at the right. This is a much more complex, extended zigzag and triangular configuration unfolding on the diagonal plane like a Kuba sequence, and picking up the types of nested squares and asymmetrical vertical divisions in the panel illustrated from Tissu Negre. And that design was printed on fabric with wood blocks carved with shallow cut-up motifs that in themselves have a curious resemblance to the dimensional Kuba surfaces. And Delaunay applied iterations of this design at different scales to skirts, dresses, and especially to voluminous scarves like the one wrapped around Tristan Zara's neck in the 1923 portrait by Robert Delaunay. On another version, she models in the photograph below. So while this evidence is both sort of circumstantial and speculative, I hope you will agree that these visual and contextual links are quite persuasive in filling in the record and confirming Delaunay's assimilation and appropriation of the Kuba aesthetic. And finally, this slide is a sampling of some of her Kuba-inflected simultaneous styles. These are the luxurious garments that she made for the Parisian elite, including many women from her own artistic circle, such as the well-known flamboyant heiress, writer and collector Nancy Cunard, or the American documentary photographer Therese Bonny, who's shown in that photograph, a self-portrait, and she wearing a simultaneous coat. And she also photographed Sonia and her models on multiple occasions. The plates are taken from the plates at the bottom are taken from the 1923 portfolio titled Robe et Tissu, which is a virtual resume of Delaunay's most recent projects. And what I find noteworthy in the case of these original designs for the embroidered jackets, dresses, hats, and skirts embellished with these Kuba-like motifs is that she kept to the predominantly brown, tan, black, cream, and orange palette that is resonant of the Congolese pattern schemes, color schemes, rather than deploying her overt and usually bold, startling use of color. And so these, in fact, images at the top left, top right, sorry, I'm on the other side now, trace the development and production of one of those beautiful embroidered skirts from the design in the drawing below to the actual garment that still exists to another painting by Robert Delaunay of Madame Mandel, one of Sonia's patrons. So. And in 1925, the International Exposition of Decorative Arts that gave the Art Deco period its name opened in Paris. And the chief architect of the Austrian pavilion was Joseph Hoffmann, who'd founded the Wiener Werkstätte in Vienna in 1903 that envisioned and practiced a unifying design aesthetic across multiple disciplines in which luxurious textiles were prominent. And one of the earliest Kuba Textiles actually to formally enter a European museum in 1887 was a Showa woman's overskirt that was acquired by the Imperial Ethnographic Museum in Vienna. And there was much interest in African textiles and art amongst the painters affiliated with the Werkstätte and the secessionist movement, such as Klimt. And Hoffmann probably in visits to probably came across Kuba Textiles, possibly in visits to the new Musée du Congo in Brussels when he was working on a very important commission there. And the black and white diagram at the top, I'm losing my place here, replicates one of the most fundamental and archaic of Kuba emblems, the Lanchong motif, which is formed by opposing black and white triangles arranged in a spiral or pinwheel. And that design alludes to the black and white patterning of a particular type of dance overskirt pieced from bark cloth, and it speaks of cultural origins through the use of bark materials associated with the first forest people of the Congo and of the region, the foragers who we also know as the Pygmies. And the small, very exquisite little panel from the late 19th century shows a Showa interpretation executed in raffia cut pile. And I would venture to say that the dotted and striated elements and Hoffman schematics imply that textual tactility. And Hoffman drew on other Kuba motifs and key symbols in the Ragusa fabric on the left from 1915, and he appears to have adapted that archetypal Woto motif for the fabric below. And the Woto motif is a very distinctive configuration of concentric or nested, irregularly sized L-shaped components. So let's see. So the greatest output, or perhaps revival, of Kuba pattern themes are the Werkstätte fabrics that were made between about 1925, 1931, after the Art Deco exposition. And these featured creative riffs on Kuba asymmetric pattern composition by key women designers such as Matilda Flogel, Maria Lickar-Strauss, and Maya Angore. The non-repetitive, interlocking angular shapes aligned on the diagonal, key Kuba features, were rendered in a range of colors. And I've just selected a few examples that especially recall the original raffia sources, and many of these designs seem to have been intended for dresses, as indicated by these two drawings, which are preserved like many others in the vast Werkstätte archive in Vienna. And the production of these fabrics coincided not only with the wide arc of Delaunay's sartorial and visual influence, but with a period of maximum translation of Kuba patterning and Afro-African motifs into European textiles, fashion, and decorative arts. And these visual themes turn up everywhere. The exciting modern styles of dress using the new Kasha fabrics were promoted in fashion magazines and society columns from Paris to New York. And I've located numerous images from the covers of Vogue, advertisements in Harper's Bazaar, dispatches in Women's Daily from the time, describing the novelty of the Parisian couture scene. In fact, in 1923, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, who's Anderson Cooper's grandmother, was married in a wedding dress trimmed with one of those the African fabric border similar to and probably made in Sonia's atelier. And one of the Parisian couturiers was Coco Chanel, and she created several dresses or suits out of her signature knitted jersey fabrics that feature Kuba patterns. The one at the top left, which is a little difficult to see, is an outright replica of a magnificent Showa's woman overskirt. And the other two that stood out to me amongst all the images I assembled are a 1925 Chantal outfit, which is decorated with cutout motifs in the distinctive shape and style of Kuba. If I can get, I'm going to see if I can get the laser to point that there. Cutout motifs in the distinctive shape and style of Kuba women's applique skirts. And this ensemble by Mangione and this one, it sort of borrows the checkerboard format of male dignitary skirts, which are interspersed with patterned squares. So what's surprising to me is that really those types of ceremonial skirts, men and women, were not really widely known at the time. So I'm surprised at these interpretations, but they're clearly based on known objects. And on the interior and graphic design side, we have a rug photograph, Thérèse Bonny, who was one of the premier design photographers of the time. She was American-born. Almost again indistinguishable from a Showa composition, a large-scale Showa composition in this case. Given the textural and technical similarity between raffia pile cloth and piled or tufted rugs, this is a rather logical adaptation, but the cloth was also adapted for, reimagined as mohair fabric for cushions by the Dutch designer Leon Cachet, which is not very different from the loads of cubic velvet cushions that are on sofas around the world today. And lastly, a series of painted papers and for wall coverings and bookend papers culled from the numerous design portfolios issued around the late 1920s. Two of these plates, this one and I believe that one probably, are actually from Delaunay's own compilation, Tissus et Tapis, which included weavings from many of the luminaries of 20th century textile art, including Annie Albers. She was commissioned to make the selection. And I just am including this panel from the exhibition as a visual key and a reminder of the source of all these westernized appropriations and reinterpretations. But all this design activity could not have taken place without the participation of the collectors and dealers in Paris, Brussels, and London who were avidly displaying and promoting African art. And there was a parallel development reflecting Kuba influence in the artistic sphere. Kuba textiles materialized as decorative props and compositional elements in modernist painting and photography. And if you look closely, and it's very difficult to discern, but in this portrait of Suzanne Valadon, there's actually the edge of a Kuba textile on the side of that floral painting. And if you visit her studio, in fact, which has been reconstructed, she occupied in Renoir's house on Montmartre, you will still see a few Kuba cloths, probably not the original ones, strewn around the room. And the works that she incorporated into her paintings, and they're certainly a testament to her aesthetic interest and appreciation for the textiles. Valadon, I'm sure as many of you know as well, is famous for having been a muse, the model, friend, the lover of some of the major painters of the time, including Renoir, Lautrec, Degas, and many other well-known figures. But her own work is known for sort of turning an empathetic gaze on the female form, such as the young child in this domestic scene depicted in the famous work, The Abandoned Doll, which naturally I've included because of the very accurate rendering of a Kuba panel cast on the floor. And in fact, it's the very same type of Kuba Ngongo or Ngende style of embroidery, a very distinctive type that Zara displayed in his study. And a large number of those panels from the northern Kuba region had been collected in the early decades. So they're quite recognizable for sort of more sparsely applied nubby cut pile and subdivided layouts with large-scale designs. And several of Valadon's still lifes, as you can see, employ patterned Kuba cloths as table coverings or backdrops in the manner of classic European tableau. The visual properties clearly served an ornamental objective within the larger composition, but in fact the cloth depicted in several of the works, this one and that one in particular, are rendered with such fidelity and tactility you can practically touch their surfaces. So for me, these Congo geometries, which are sort of set or foil as a kind of classic soft flower arrangements, also capture kind of modernist tradition between abstraction and the confluence of the two genres that reflects Valadon's own trajectory and experience as an artist during this period of change, an artistic transformation, which gave us our modern era. And on the opposite side, we have a very different genre of Cubist collage in several works by Georges Braque, still lifes painted between 1929 and 1939, which feature very complexly fractured, interlayered decorative planes and volumes. And Braque constantly rearranged and remixed and added to his studio props of papers and cloths and woods and found materials. But there are a couple of consistent visual elements in these assemblages that perhaps wishfully, I don't know, I speculate hint at a Kuba origin. The background of these three pieces, here, here, and here, strike me as reminiscent of an all-over Kuba lattice or diamond field pattern, with sort of dimensional qualities captured in the contrast between dark and light. And so does the swath of design here and in this painting. which I think are very similar to the optical zigzags of a Kuba composition. And presumably, Braque was more concerned with the visual dynamics within his pictorial assemblage rather in such textiles' ethnographic provenance, although his Cubist style had in fact been strongly impacted and shaped by African abstraction. And he would surely have taken note of the Kuba textiles that were all around and sought after by his contemporaries. Oh, it's not it's wrong at one. Okay, there we go. And one of those people, one of the major figures of modernist art, was also the most prominent collector of Kuba textiles. And this was Henri Matisse. And most people who are familiar with the tradition of Kuba applique skirts, like this stunning example, which is now in the collection of the Met in New York, assume that it was that distinctive mode that inspired the catalogue techniques and semi-abstraction of his later career. But in fact, as implied by his 1947 paper collage and cutout, paradoxically titled Le Velours, the Velvet, it was the cut-pile embroideries, commonly known as velours de Kassai or Kassai velvets, that in his own words were a source of endless fascination. And there's a rich trove of Cartier-Bresson photographs documenting Matisse in his studio and bedroom in Vence, south of France, between 1933 and 1934, which show numerous Kuba textiles pinned to the walls amid his own paintings and the huge variety of world textiles he collected all his life, which included Ottoman embroideries, Coptic curtains, Turkish kaleems, tapa cloth, kimono, and many other types, which he referred to as his working library and that were essential to his pictorial vocabulary. However, Matisse never depicted or represented Kuba textiles in the same way. I've only identified one late painting from the same period, The Dream or La Rêve from 1940, which I'm sure incorporates a Kuba design. And significantly, he pinned the same work, above a beautiful little Showa velvet over the mantelpiece in that photograph. And so instead, Matisse drew on Kuba abstraction in a more conceptual way. He responded to what he described as their instinctive geometry and the spontaneity and exploratory means by which the Showa embroiderers in particular build their compositions block by block. And this informed his creative process and his investigation of contour, shape, as well as how to set about composing his improvisatory arrangements and juxtapositions of color forms in the paper cutouts. So far, my focus has been on the European sphere, but there was a comparable burst of interest and activity in the United States. It begins with William Shepard, who I alluded to previously, who not only systematically assembled the first American and, in fact, the first world collection of Kuba art, but played a key role in promoting Kuba culture at the turn of the 20th century. Shepard's dedicated effort was quite different from the somewhat ad hoc way in which textiles and other artifacts had been previously obtained by the traders and explorers navigating the rivers around just prior to his arrival in the Kassai. And he was obviously a man of enormous charisma and capability who'd been able to sort of maneuver through the racial segregation and the economic and social racism of the South to become the first Black missionary stationed in the Congo, co-founding the Presbyterian mission in the Kassai in 1890. In 1892, having learned the Bouchon language, which he said was difficult, he made a daring journey into Kuba territory, which was guarded against all outsiders, literally on pain of death, and had the extraordinary luck to be taken as a reincarnated ancestor of a Kuba royal. Clearly, his ability to speak the language and his general charisma was a factor as well. This reception and his subsequent friendship with the king, seeded by his profound interest and admiration for the Kuba people, inspired him to assiduously document what he observed and acquired over the 20 years he lived in the region. And his first-hand observations about this art tradition, including the types of textiles worn at the longest-lasting royal court in Central Africa, are invaluable given the lack of information from this period. Most of the people who obtained the textiles at the very beginning, before the official ethnographers arrived, didn't ask the kinds of questions we'd like to get information about today. Shepard is considered the first true ethnographer of the Congo. And as the longest and most deeply embedded foreign resident there, he was someone who witnessed the changes and the pressures placed on the Kuba as a result of the intensifying colonial exploitation and all the accompanying atrocities of the rubber trade and Leopold's grabbing of resources. Shepard's contribution to Western knowledge of the peoples of the Kasai was recognized in the United States. He was received by Roosevelt. He was given a medal by the Royal Geographic Society in London and all that. But his pioneering role was ultimately overshadowed by Emile Tordet and Leo Frobenius, the European field collectors who led those research expeditions for the European Museum shortly after. However, Shepard's mission to elevate the discourse and popular misconceptions and imagery of Black Africans and the so-called mysterious Dark Continent set him off on a very successful series of speaking and fundraising tours across the South, where he displayed some of his 400 Kuba objects as exemplary of the achievements and sophistication of the people and the makers. And one of the photographs, these are photographs from his own albums. This one's obviously documenting one of the talks. This young boy is wrapped rather oddly in a woman's skirt. These are some of the objects he would take on tour. And this is a photograph of his great friend, who was the son of the king, who got embroiled in a very complicated succession afterwards. Anyway, so get further here. So Shepard later sold his collection to Hampton College, which was his alma mater, in 1911, where they were instrumental in the artistic and craft education of many generations of Hampton students. So we have a domestic science class in a photograph from 1920 who are shown examining some of his magnificent late 19th century textiles, including one related to the type of bark dance skirt. I think there's one in the exhibition, and it's the kind I mentioned earlier. And one of the most important African-American artists educated at Hampton was John Biggers, whose 1946 painting, Starry Crown, pulsates with a dense constellation of graphic black and white triangles that are equally resonant of the geometries associated with African-American quilting traditions, as well as of that major Landschung emblem I mentioned in connection earlier to Hoffman's designs. And Biggers returned to Hampton in 1992 to paint the mural House of the Turtle, which deploys the same visual theme. And incidentally, I just discovered last night in the Mintz collection a Biggers lithograph from 1992 titled Family Ark that also incorporates this design in the framework and the dais supporting the iconic animal icons of his African ark. However, it was not until the 1920s that Kuba Textiles became more widely known in the United States. In 1923, the Brooklyn Museum organized the first exhibition dedicated to Congolese art under the enthusiastic direction of their curator, Stuart Cullen, who also jumped on the design bandwagon and conceived a novel form of museum merchandising, a very familiar experience for all of us today. The American apparel industry had already started making use of ethnic textiles as sources for their primitivist pattern ideas for the fabrication of new types of women's sportswear. And unlike in Europe, where the debt to the indigenous textile makers was glossed over or ignored, Cullen seized on the promotional value in exploiting the exoticism of Congo culture and oversaw the production of a variety of merchandise, ranging from rugs and blankets to clothing and upholstery, copied from the textiles on display, such as I keep pressing the wrong button, such as all these things, which he actually displayed in the gallery. He obviously did photo shoots in the galleries. And these caused a sensation, actually, and there was a rush of critical appreciation of the beauty and the unusual textures, not only of Cullen's fabrics, but actually of the original cloth, which are captured in many of the newspaper clippings and magazine features that I show. And in fact, it inspired many of the fashion designers of the time, and they deliberately designed clothing which was featured in Bonwit Tellers in the windows of their Fifth Avenue store and in other magazines. And they were actually designs taken again from the textiles on display. And then in about 4 or 5 years later, there was a second important exhibition in New York, also focusing primarily on Congo traditions from the collection of Belgian colonial official Blondiot. And this one was curated by the influential African-American cultural philosopher and critic Alain Locke, an intellectual force in the Harlem Renaissance. And in the catalogue he did at the time, Locke drew attention to the African artist's methods of, quote, working by decorative intent and free imaginative treatment. And he urged Black artists to rediscover and recapture the creative originality of their cultural and ancestral heritage in their own work. And Locke planned to install those objects in a new museum of African art in Harlem that never materialized, but he subsequently arranged for a large portion to be donated to Hampton, where they joined Shepard's Kuba Collection. So, Alain Locke's advocacy for a Black modernist art style inspired by and grounded in the iconography and aesthetics of African art found expression in a group of African-American visual artists, some of whom had lived in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. Both Palmer Hayden's foregrounding of a fang mask and a Kuba I keep doing this. I hope you edit that out. Foregrounding of a fang mask and a Kuba panel, and notice how meticulously he renders the details of the Kuba cloth. And Malvin Johnson's similarly composed painting subvert the conventions and symbolic associations of a traditional still life, such as those ones made by Suzanne Valadon, signifying an African cultural identity closely aligned with Locke's vision. And they project a vitality and a kind of an energy very distinct from Man Ray's formalist and surrealistic juxtapositions of cloth and wood, another Kuba cloth, from the same era. And these Kuba and Congolese geometries that Locke singled out are progressively simplified and stylized in works by other artists, notably those of Lou Malou Jones and Elizabeth Catlett, reflecting their distinct printmaking and textile design mediums. But as Catlett's title, Roots, indicates, the motifs continue to be charged symbols as much as striking graphic elements. And all these artists are interlinked in interesting ways, sort of along a Kuba thread. Elizabeth Catlett had in fact studied art with both James Porter, whose work is shown there below, and John Biggers at Howard. And then she in turn later mentored John Biggers at Hampton, where she too had the opportunity to study Shepard's textiles. And Walker Evans' portfolio documenting the nearly 500 works of African art displayed in the only exhibition of African art ever held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1935, in which a single Kuba prestige cloth made the modernist cut, was distributed to the historically Black colleges and providing a rich and encyclopedic resource for all these renowned artists, educators, and intellectuals who emerged from those institutions. And finally, in the corner, jumping ahead quite a few decades to a later generation of Black artists that speaks to vital issues of the time, the civil rights movement, feminism, social activism of the late 60s, when Faith Ringgold painted her Black Light series, which utilized dark palette, large-scale Kuba-derived color forms. In this case, that same motif I've been drawing attention to as a structural framework and a symbolic underpinning. And it's a significant image and a specific referent that threads back to the earliest debates about African aesthetics and their pertinence to the diverse community and the individual visual concerns of African American artists over time. But such debates took place very far beyond the Kuba village of Mweka, the home of the Congolese artist Jiletendo Osheletendu, born around 1890, a pivotal year in the Kuba region, who's seen in the photograph here at her left. And Jiletendo's works on paper languished in obscurity for decades, but they recently been reinserted into their rightful place in the modernist narrative, as well as in the history of 20th century painting and visual culture in the Congo. But how these paintings came about and the context of their production and exhibition is controversial and mired in a history of colonial paternalism and ambiguous power relationships. Jiletendo had multiple identities. He was a chief of the Lulua people, as well as a tailor, a painter, and in later life, a textile maker. And around 1930, Georges Thierry, an entrepreneurial Belgian colonial administrator in the Kasai, and an artist himself, became aware of his talent for mural painting. Thierry supplied Jiletendo with art materials, watercolors, inks, brushes, and paper, with the idea of commissioning him to produce compositions to sell and exhibit in Europe, as he had already done quite successfully with another amateur artist and muralist, Albert Lubaki, who's also regarded as one of the pioneers of Congo painting. Lubaki worked in a folkloric pictorial style, a popular genre for mural decoration in the Congo at that time, and that became particularly associated with several art workshops established in the 1930s and the 1950s. But these two paintings, which set figural scenes of that type, with displaying the conditions of daily life and colonialism, within a geometric framework, revealed Jiletendo's visual range. He was equally brilliant at devising a mode of abstract geometric composition that tapped a legacy of indigenous pattern creativity in textile design and wood carving, which were separate specialties for men and women. And his connection to the shared pattern repertoire is underlined by this photograph because he's shown posing in front of a Kuba woven wall or panel or mat, which is traditionally fabricated by male weavers, and it's decorated with large, simplified motifs. It's not quite clear whether Thierry did more than encourage and promote Jiletendo or actually directed him to work specifically with these kinds of themes, inventing, in the opinion of certain contemporary critics, a type of colonial primitivism, modernism for external consumption. Obviously, he was a superb and imaginative artist, and I strongly feel that situating Jiletendo within the rich Kasai cultural and visual tradition offers a totally different perspective and agency. Even, unfortunately, there's no record, as far as I know, of his thinking about his own sources or artistic ideas. So I was thrilled to be able to include a group of these exquisite freehand abstractions in the catalogue because it's a very important dimension to the discussion of 20th century Kuba art. And I think you'll agree they show striking affinities with the modernist textiles and fabrics designs we've been looking at. But these works were virtually unknown until a few years ago, although Thierry had orchestrated several exhibitions between the 1930s and 40s in Switzerland and Paris and Luxembourg and in Brussels. And in Belgium, curiously, his watercolors were combined with works by the Belgian surrealists Magritte and Delvaux. But much more problematically, Jiletendo was never made aware of or benefited financially from these exhibitions, although he continued to produce artworks for Thierry for at least another decade, including illustrations based on raffia textile patterns for a children's book. And so his painterly vocabulary was clearly shaped by his immersion in the Kuba visual realm. But not only does he translate the intentional pattern eccentricities and the abstract shapes and the morphing linearities into freehand and fluid and colorful geometrical schemes, he was so deeply grounded in Kuba aesthetics that he could break out with intricate reimaginings and riffs on conventional motifs and arrangements, taking the art into a new dimension with the same free-spirited inventiveness and ingenuity of women textile makers. So this intensive period, at the beginning of the century, of engagement, appropriation of Kuba design lasted about 30 years. And it was followed in the 30s by photoethnographic interest, framed particularly by photography, which has since generated a huge archive of images of Kuba peoples and ceremony, the kinds of images we see today. This reflected the growing numbers of visitors, colonial officials, tourists, anthropologists, and documentary photographers and filmmakers who flocked to the Kuba region as roads and rails were built to watch dances and masquerades, both those that were specially performed for them, as well as the major ceremonies that were essential to Kuba culture and ritual. And as the Belgian colonial machinery became more entrenched, these sort of visual spectacles served as a kind of ethnographic propaganda for the colony. But the Kuba were not passive subjects. Royal permission had to be sought. The king and the notables actively managed his official image and orchestrated and controlled the photo opportunities they granted people like the life photojournalist Elliot Elisafon, whose avid interest in African art drew him to the Kuba region in 1947 and again in 1970. And Elisafon's archives, I've only got one picture from Elisafon here. It's this one here, taken in 1970, along with photographs by Zagórski, Kazimierz Zagórski, a Polish photographer based in the Congo, are now at the National, and he was Zagórski, this is a Zagórski photograph, and these are other photographs by visiting colonialists. These are images from the many commercial photography outfits that produced postcard images that were sent by the thousand from the colonies around the world, and really documenting the incredible richness of Kuba costume and dance performances. And this photograph at the bottom left, which is documenting the installation of a Kuba regent in the 1970s by an Italian photographer who accompanied Father Joseph Cornet, who was the most important anthropologist in the Congo at the time and the founder of the National Museums of what was then Zaire. And here's the iconic image of the Kuba king in his full state regalia. These are women title holders from the 1930s, again dressed in the incredibly lavish and heavily beaded textile skirts and layers of overskirts, and a woman wearing an applique, also an early photograph, a woman wearing a very classic type of applique dance overskirt over a coiled wraparound skirt. So, actually, I'm going to go back one step again. So all these occasions provided many opportunities for the Kuba to sell textiles and carvings to the foreigners. Early in the century, those objects had mainly been traded for commodities that were valued by the Kuba and important to their culture: cowrie shells, beads, copper crosses, and salt. But once the Belgians imposed a cash economy in the 1930s, the king, the royal family, and the general population needed greater sources of income. And that's pertinent to understanding the continual outflow and production of textiles from the Kasai. The making of textiles, as these images show, and the wearing of traditional garments is a core cultural value. The Kuba people continued to wear raffia garments through the 1950s, and always for celebrations, funerals, and important occasions like royal visits or the enthronement of the new king in 1969. And the provision and offering of raffia textiles for funerary ritual and burials is also an important and extremely significant aspect of the textile tradition. It's not a dimension I'm getting into here, but there's an exhibition, I think, that's just opened up I'm not quite sure where. I'll have to look it up. Oh, it's at the Chicago Institute that is included Kuba raffia textiles as textiles of mourning and memory. Kuba had exported raffia cloth long before the colonialists arrived. Once that occurred, however, it seemingly stimulated production beyond their own requirements and regional trade networks. However, those early types of textiles are virtually indistinguishable from textiles they made for their own use. They have the same extremely fine weaves, the fine quality of needlework, and the complex patterning, because those required a lot of time to make, sometimes months of labor, and the time itself, the investment of time and labor, was a very important aspect of their symbolic value. And it's possible that outside interest did inspire a degree of pattern innovation, but the process was already underway as Kuba design evolved out of the formal, archaic symbolism of ancient cloth. And it only accelerated over the 20th century, which saw progressive stylistic changes, including greater visual flamboyance and use of color. And in addition, in the late 1930s, Catholic nuns in the Kasai began promoting embroidered raffia cloth and basketry as a source of income for their own schools and clinics, where they instructed young women in their workshops or outsourced embroidery to women in the villages, primarily in the Bouchon area, which accounts for the style of design. But they also pushed them to produce simplified, bold-scale designs that had none of the visual effects and improvisational energies of the traditional styles, because those kinds of textiles are quicker to produce. You can make them in perhaps a couple of afternoons as opposed to months of work. And the time, of course, allowed for the elaboration of pattern. So there were many different types of production and styles at play for a long time. But new scholarly attention in the 70s and early 80s, followed by several museum exhibitions and catalogues in Europe, generated another big spurt of production of design cloth in the DRC to meet the expanding foreign market. The textiles were no longer only made in the Kasai, but also in collectors and workshops, such as the one that Stephen Burke's man-made documented in Kinshasa last year. Kuba cloth became a global commodity, taking us back to where I began today, with the multiplicity and contexts and forms where its visual impact is so strongly felt. It's now a worldwide design language, even as it continues to develop in Kinshasa and the DRC in the form that Stephen and Malika documented. However, I think I've shown you enough fashion, fabric, and furnishing designs, but a phenomenon that repeats cyclically with ever-widening application. So I thought I would end with a few more contemporary artworks and projects that not only reflect the increasing visibility of Kuba cloth and African textile art in general from the mid-1980s on, but also give a sense of how these references are manipulated today. So these three ensembles reveal different angles or takes on Kuba patterning by a European, an African American, and an African designer. The black and white appliqued checkerboard skirt dress on the left by Karl Lagerfeld. It hit the runway about 6 months after a major exhibition at the Depere Museum in 1989 in Paris. And I can tell you, it is an exact replica of one of the beautiful women's skirts in the exhibition. And although the record of its making in the Lagerfeld Chanel archive seems to have disappeared, he did exactly what his predecessors in Parisian couture always did, helping themselves to this incredible resource without any attribution. As did many of the other major fashion companies like Missoni, Vuitton, Versace, Prada, and so on, and it filtered out into streetwear and popular fashion as well. So, by contrast, Patrick Kelly, the second work here, an African-American designer working in Paris around the same time, was aware of Kuba cloth and honored Kuba origins in this witty and playful style, fully aware of the source of his design. And he's adapted the subtle elegance of the minimalist white-on-white women's Kuba skirts, the applique style, which is a complementary mode of abstraction developed by Kuba women, and it also speaks, the dress speaks to the materiality of the fiber, not raffia in this case, but similarly evocative of those finely textured and supple weaves. And then a striking ensemble by Al-Fadi, the prominent Tuareg designer based in Niger, epitomizing his vision of decolonizing African fashion by recentering it in a local modern industry using a pan-African aesthetic and style that is equally responsive to worldwide trends, and while emphasizing handcrafted materials, local materials, that he regarded as equivalent to the luxury handmade materials used in couture. And the far image, slightly different, takes us into the world of music and performance, and it's a monumental skirt painted by Keith Haring for Grace Jones with swirling lines, derived also from Kuba Applicator's Abstraction, and that you can see that mixed into a lot of his sort of graffiti-like works. He also drew on other textile sources. And she wore this monumental skirt for a famous or infamous New Year's Eve performance at the Roseland in New York in 1987. And then moving out of the New York downtown club scene, the avant-garde art world, to other creative borrowings. In the Broadway production of the very long-lasting and famous musical The Lion King, for which Julie Taymor conceived fabulous costume designs that used and mixed Kuba pattern fabrics with Japanese-influenced outfits to project and draw her audience into the life, the vitality, the colors, and the kinetic patterns of the African landscape and characters. And then to the bastion of high culture, the Metropolitan Opera, where Jürgen Rose apparently found in the dense linearity of a Kuba embroidered skirt. This is actually an appliqué skirt, but he also did another version of the embroidered skirt, a commonality apparently with Celtic patterning to make an appropriate majestic road for King Marcus from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. And it's one of the few times he actually uses and repurposes an actual textile for this garment. And now a few contemporary artworks dealing with representation, self-representation, and post-colonial identities that make use of Kuba reference. The series at the top left, ironically titled My Kings, by one of the most prominent Congolese artists today, Papi Shindele, who makes satirical use of emblematic Congolese iconography here. The state regalia and adornment and posture of the Kuba king we saw in an earlier image, combined with stylized masks hiding the identities of Congolese leaders and politicians to address social issues and make commentaries about political power and corruption and colonial legacies in the DRC today. And in the center, the Moroccan-born but Belgian-based artist Moussa Lamrambat also engages themes of neocolonialism and the decolonizing of cloth, shrouding or veiling his subjects in Kuba skirts with labyrinthine patterns that become a form of concealment and distancing so that the women wearing them are not really available to our gaze. Whereas in this watercolor by the French Martinique artist based in New York, Elizabeth Colomba, her Shakera girl is in radiant command of her beauty, grace, and identity, part of Colomba's ongoing artwork reframing visual narratives around Black women utilizing historical and allegorical themes and imagery. And note the graceful loop of the very old and well-known Kuba motif named Oxhorn, which unfolds behind her. And at the very bottom of the slide, I end with a photo of a famous Congolese sapeur, Coco Lingwala, dressed to the nines in Kuba suiting and top hat for the annual celebration of the death of the father of SAPE, Stavros Niakos. The sapeur are a clothing identity movement originating in the colonial era. It's a style of great elegance, dandyism, high fashion that is both an art form and a state of mind. So that concludes our survey. Very rapid, very wordy, and I could have shown you dozens more images, and I had to limit myself. So.